lots of different predictions that allow us to sort of see what would be the extinction rate just from climate change with varying degrees of heating. But that has ignored exactly what you just said. That has ignored that interaction among species. Species are parts of communities. They interact with each other, sometimes with thousands of other species over their lifespan. And you mentioned predators and prey. That's an obvious one. You know, if a predator is a specialist predator, it kind of only eats a few different species. If those prey species go extinct and they go extinct quickly, then it doesn't have the evolutionary time frame to adapt to a new diet, basically, and then therefore it runs out of food and so it dies as well. But you can also think of pollinators. I think you mentioned pollinators and plants. If many pollinators are plant specific.
Before we get started, I have a quick favor. I've been self-funding the Finding Genius podcast for 5 years now. I've done over 3,000 episodes, and as you can see on YouTube, we're up over 1 million views on the channel, which is fantastic. The next thing I really want to push on is to get up to 10,000 subscribers, because once we do, we'll be able to put a donate button, and we'll be able to solicit donations to help keep the podcast running and to also get the Finding Genius Foundation moving along. We have a big project studying anxiety, depression, and PTSD, and working on a product to help people overcome these problems, because I've seen them explode recently after the last 2 years of the whole virus situation. So if you would, please subscribe to the podcast. That would help us tremendously. Give us a thumbs up and check in the description for Buy Me a Coffee. It's about $5. If you could buy me a coffee, I'd really appreciate it. It would help keep the channel going, and I love coffee. Thank you.
Forget frequently asked questions,
common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast, now part of the Finding Genius Foundation. I have Professor Corey Bradshaw. He's the Matthew Flinders Professor of Global Ecology, part of the College of Science and Engineering at Flinders University. And we're going to talk about his modeling of species extinction. So, Corey, thank you for coming.
Thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah, it's kind of an unusual topic. What's your background and how did you gain an interest in looking at the future extinction of species?
Well, I guess it sort of culminates into quite a bit of my career putting together very, simple things like looking at the fate of specific populations. I've done a lot of work on everything from feral species, trying to look at how to get rid of rabbits, for example, in Australia, or foxes or cats or pigs, that kind of thing. But I sort of really cut my teeth in biodiversity conservation, going back 25 years ago, I guess, looking at how we are changing the face of the planet, both in the oceans as well as on land. So I did a lot of work in the tropics, and what really sort of struck me was the degree of the rate of change, the rate of degradation, really, that we're seeing. It's sort of really in your face over that even my time scale, my lifetime, seeing the amount of deforestation that's happened and the expansion of urbanization and increasing agricultural intensification, all that sort of thing. And what happens is that species suffer as a result. But when you try to get a handle on sort of the global picture, we've got really good indices, and they've been going back for decades themselves, about, the threat status of most species that we're aware of. At least we don't really have a good idea about microbes and, soil organisms, that sort of thing. But the IUCN Red List of threatened species has been around for decades, and it's really most people are familiar with. They've heard the terms like endangered and threatened and vulnerable and critically endangered. Those really come from the Red List. But they're a single species and sometimes even a single population level assessment. So you say, well, this species has declined by this much over this amount of time, and there are certain criteria for placing them into different categories. If they're very small or if they've declined very rapidly over a very short time frame, then they get into this, threatened up to the critically endangered kind of situation, which basically means that without some pretty intense intervention, they'll likely go extinct in the foreseeable future, inverted commas.
Well, quick question here. For a lot, maybe not all creatures, but for most creatures that I know of, something eats them, and then they eat something else. Whether it's plants or animals, etc. So, how much can you tell about the health of the given species, not just by number, but by again declination of its predators because there's not enough of them to eat, or the abundance of its prey because there's not enough of them to eat its prey, and so they're going crazy and multiplying everywhere.
Yeah, so that's a lovely segue into the current paper. So the idea that, species are threatened from multiple drivers, including climate change, has been around for quite some time. But again, most of that has been a single species assessment, so sort of assuming that a species kind of in a vacuum. So in terms of climate change, it's about, exceeding what we call thermal tolerances, upper thermal tolerances. So it gets too hot basically and things die. But those assessments have been around for a while, and lots of different predictions that allow us to sort of see what would be the extinction rate just from climate change with varying degrees of heating. But that has ignored exactly what you just said. That has ignored that interaction among species. Species are parts of communities. They interact with each other, sometimes with thousands of other species over their lifespan. And you mentioned predators and prey. That's an obvious one. If a predator is a specialist predator, it kind of only eats a few different species. If those prey species go extinct, and they go extinct quickly, then it doesn't have the evolutionary time frame to adapt to a new diet, basically, and then therefore it runs out of food, and so it dies as well. But you can also think of pollinators. I think you mentioned pollinators and plants. If many pollinators are plant specific, they'll only pollinate specific species of plants. And if those pollinators go extinct, well, then the plant can't reproduce, and eventually it's going to, drop off the perch. Or think of parasites and hosts. A lot of people don't like to think of parasites, but in fact, we have a wonderful diversity of parasites on the planet, and that makes up a huge component of what we call biodiversity. So again, many of these parasites are fairly host specific. This is why, for example, if your pet gets fleas, they might bite you, but they can't really live on you because they're quite host specific. So if the host goes extinct, well, then all the parasites that depend on that host will also go extinct. And in fact, we kind of estimated that many of the mass extinctions, a lot of that loss has been parasites. They're a vastly underappreciated component of biodiversity.
Well, how would parasites help biodiversity?
Well, there's many examples of that. So one example I really like. Now, for the life of me, I can't actually remember the name of the species, but there is a parasite, and I think it's a type of helminth that infects shellfish in various parts of the southern hemisphere. And what this does is that it prevents the shellfish from burrowing into the bottom of the sea. And usually we're talking sort of seabeds, very flat, mud flat kind of areas. Prevents them from digging in entirely and covering their shells completely with the mud and the silt. What that means is there's this little hard substratum sticking up above the mud on which various other invertebrate species and plants can colonize. And in fact, without certain parasites in these systems, there wouldn't be an ecosystem in these shallow sea areas because there's nothing to attach to. It's just mud. So in this particular case, an entire ecosystem, and we're talking, seaweeds and barnacles and other small crustaceans, they all live in and on these basically little bumps of shell sticking out of the mud, all due to this single parasite. Now that's quite a illustrative example of the kind of thing that parasites can do, but they also play a strong role in modifying population numbers. So, if certain things kind of get out of whack in terms of too many species of, let's say, a herbivore that eats a lot of different plants, and you can get overbrowsing and you can get collapse and death of trees. We've actually seen that in koalas in Australia, for example, when they get hyperabundant in certain areas, they just eat all the trees and kill all the eucalypts. And then, of course, you've got a dead forest and nothing else can really live in that. So it's sort of a cascading effect, whereas parasites can kind of keep those numbers down so that they're not into these, hyperabundant densities.
I see. So parasites can, they work in niche construction, I guess maybe unintentionally. And then also too, without them, there might not even be food for other animals. And without them, there might be an overabundance and like a habitat destruction by animals, like you said, koalas. So I guess there's at least three scenarios in which they're important.
Yeah, and we've probably only started to scratch the surface of the importance of parasites. Now, again, most people think of parasites as a nuisance, but every species has some form of an ecological role in its system. Otherwise, it wouldn't evolve to persist there. So even things like mosquitoes. Mosquitoes are food for bats, for example. People hate mosquitoes, but they're quite an important part of the food for many different species.
Before we continue, I've been personally funding the Finding Genius podcast for 4.5 years now, which has led to 2,700 plus interviews of clinicians, researchers, scientists, CEOs, and other amazing people who are working to advance science and improve our lives and our world. Even though this podcast gets 100,000 plus downloads a month, we need your help to reach hundreds of thousands more worldwide. Please visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click on Support Us. We have 3 levels of membership from $10 to $49 a month, including perks such as the ability to see ahead in our interview calendar and ask questions of upcoming guests, transcripts of podcasts you're interested in, the ability to request specific topics or guests, and more. Visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click Support Us today. Now back to the show.
Have you cataloged, let's say the top 5, 10, 15 ways that put pressure on certain species? If you could even do such a thing, or what are you trying to figure out with your study of and your modeling of how species can go extinct?
Well, this particular one was focusing primarily on climate change. Now, I'll just back up a little bit. In the past, we didn't have, at least over the last, few 100,000 years, we've had quite large climate fluctuations, and they certainly have contributed to extinctions. The climate change and the rapid heating sort of at the onset of the Holocene sort of 15, 16,000 years ago probably contributed to the loss of a lot of what we call megafauna. So things like mammoths and diprotodons and, saber-toothed cats and all those sorts of things. But humans also came on the scene about the same time in many areas. And so it was probably a combination of components. In the last few hundred years, of course, extinctions have been largely driven by overexploitation and habitat loss. And that habitat loss is principally from agricultural intensification to feed a rapidly growing human population. And so climate change has really only been on the radar for a couple of decades about what it is doing now, and also the potential for it to start to dominate the extinction processes in the near future. And many people, and I come back to these, analyses and meta-analyses looking at the different predictions from climate change alone. And this is sort of ignoring all the other components. I'll come back to the other components in a moment. But they sort of took all of these very single species approaches and sort of lumped them all together and said, okay, we're going to lose, at current trajectory, say 5 to 10% of species from climate change. And that's just exceeding their thermal tolerances. When we saw that, we kind of said, that actually doesn't make a lot of sense from an ecological perspective because of these connections. And so when we started to look into what the magnitude of those connections and the loss of those connections and what that would mean for extinctions, it sort of kind of on average doubled the expected extinction rates. Now, we've also included in this particular model projected land use change. So that's continued loss of habitats. And again, we're only dealing with the terrestrial realm in this case, so just on land. And we're only dealing with vertebrates. So we haven't really touched plants or invertebrates, mainly because there's not a lot of data that we can use to make the linkages between species. I'll come back to that in a minute as well. So incorporating both the projected land use change, so that's the increasing loss of space that certain species can occupy, and climate change. It actually turns out that climate change is going to become very soon the dominant driver of extinctions on land.
How do you know?
Because unless the land use projections are way off and we completely degrade our forests even more, for example, things like, we cut down most of the Amazon for cash crops and livestock, and the West African rainforest collapses and we cut down most of the boreal forest or it burns down, that kind of thing probably would then exceed climate change. But under current projections, climate change will precipitate more indirect loss, that is what we call co-extinction, so that the loss of one species from climate change then precipitating a loss from all the dependent species, more than habitat loss will in the future, even though habitat loss in the past has been the dominant driver. And that's based on That's based on all of the assessments across the entire globe that we used to construct this model, and we tied it and validated it to current predictions of the distribution of what we call diversity. So that's just the number of species in a given area.
What about alterations to the microbiome of these creatures? Maybe that's a precursor where it comes along with habitat destruction.
Oh,
if I can't eat a plant, or if I can't eat another animal I normally eat, okay, fine. But if because of, again, the temperatures that I'm now in, or because of the loss of my habitat or the loss of other creatures that I interact with, my microbiome may be changed. Maybe the bacteria that, help me do XYZ processes now are compromised. And no one can see that, I guess, without looking. But maybe that is what caused a weakening of my ability to adapt, or, who knows? Maybe that's a huge driver.
Yeah, and I don't think you're wrong. I don't think we have quite enough information at the global scale, but there's certainly some good examples of that kind of thing out there. So in the model, we did include a component of adaptation. So there's a certain amount of prey switching, if you will, or resource switching that can happen. And there's also dispersal in the model. So species can move to areas that are more climatically acceptable for their life history processes. But in terms of the microbiome, adaptability is a big part of being able to persist through massive climate changes in the past, or massive disturbances. You can even think of, dinosaurs going extinct 66 million years ago. There's a lot of that was because there wasn't the adaptation potential in a lot of those species to adjust to those new situations. Now, the microbiome, there's a great example here in Australia of koalas. Koalas eat eucalypts, and they actually have, depending on where you are in Australia, they have very specific tree species that they feed on. And that's really because the microbiome is very specific to that particular suite of species that they eat. Most koalas only eat, maybe from 4 or 5 different species of eucalypts, but that changes depending on where you are in Australia. Now, if you take a koala, say from South Queensland, and you stick it in South Australia, unless the exact same species composition is here, which is usually not the case, they'll often starve. A lot of possums are in the same category. You can't really move them around too quickly or too far away from the distribution of where they grew up and where they've adapted to, because their microbiomes are so different, even to the point where mother koalas will feed what they call pap, which is basically just concentrated fecal material, directly to their infants, so that they inoculate the gut with the mother's microbiome, so that when the joey gets off the milk, it can start to go to leaves straight away and be capable of digesting them.
Well, again, any disturbance to an animal, whether higher and lower temperatures, the availability of plants, et cetera, the creature will attempt adaptation through epigenetic change. And that epigenetic change, again, may influence the ability of various bacteria to be successful within the creature and provide, short chain fatty acids, whatever they're providing as a trade with the creature. So I don't know, maybe there's this whole progression that is largely unseen that causes stresses that become more and more amplified to the point where, the creatures can't exist properly, and then they die.
Yeah,
I don't know if any of that is being looked at. It's the big picture. It's crazy.
Yeah, it certainly has been looked at on very micro scales. Again, it's hard to get sort of the breadth of information that would be necessary to do that globally. But you've also reminded me, of another process that contributes to these declines, and that's, of course, the loss of genetic diversity, which is, again, tied into microbial and other processes in the gut and even in the brain. So, as there are 2 paradigms in conservation biology. We like to call them paradigms, but one is we call the declining population paradigm. So that's a process that drives a formerly large population to a small population. And then we have the small population paradigm. So once it reaches this small stage, all sorts of other components start kicking in that actually make it more difficult for that species to persist over time. And that is everything from just the fact that you're small, you tend to have a smaller range size. So let's take the example of the great auk, which was a large marine that lived in the northern hemisphere for much of the last few 100,000 years, if not millions, and went extinct. I can't remember exact date, but I think it went extinct in the late 19th century. It was primarily harvested for its eggs, people love the eggs, also the meat, and it was spread right throughout the North Atlantic through many different countries in many different islands. But because it was so intensively hunted, the last remaining population dwindled to live on this small islet just off of the mainland of Iceland. And then that islet just happened to blow up in a volcanic explosion. And if you say, okay, what caused the extinction of the great auk? Well, the proximate cause was the explosion of this volcano, but the ultimate cause was the loss of the range of the species. Now that's just bad luck, really. But you're more susceptible to bad luck situations like a bushfire or a cyclone or whatever if your population is very small. But also what happens when your population is very small is that you tend to get inbreeding. So there aren't as many individuals out there that are genetically different from you. You tend to breed with relatives more often. And what that does is it drives down the genetic diversity of the average individual. And then it can lead to what we call inbreeding depression, which is defined as the loss of genetic diversity that triggers loss of fitness in some way. So loss of fitness could be your survival rate's a little bit lower, or your fertility is a bit lower, or your longevity is a little bit lower, or you make just dumb decisions. we all make jokes about inbreeding and not being connected to very clever ways to do your life. So when genetic diversity declines and inbreeding kicks in, you also get all sorts of corollary problems, like, for example, you're more susceptible to disease, or you're more susceptible to changes in microbiome, or you can't adapt to different microbiomes as quickly, or you can't disperse away from a disturbance as quickly as, say, a fully outbred individual might be able to do. So you get into this, what we call an extinction vortex. So you get small, you get more inbred, you get lower fitness, the population gets smaller, and so on and so forth, until you sort of spiral down into total extinction. Now that's without sort of any intervention or a change of scene that suddenly brings more resources, or might separate a population into two that then allowed them to evolve in different pathways, which thereby increasing diversity through genetic drift over time. But that usually takes quite a long time. And yes, evolution can happen quickly, but in the ecological scale of communities, chances are that adaptation is not going to be able to sort of keep pace with the rate of climate change that we're seeing today.
So are there particular species that you're studying that are in, some level of danger that you're trying to, model out what's going to happen to them?
Yeah, well, there's quite a number of species. I mean, a lot of, there's two ways that these sort of cascades can occur. One is the more sort of commonly understood way of, let's say you lose a plant resource and the herbivore that eats that plant resource will go extinct. And then the predator that eats that herbivore then loses its prey and then it goes extinct. But there's also what we call top-down processes. So for example, you lose a top predator, and then all of the herbivores that it fed on explode in number, and then they eat all of the plants, and then all of the other things that depend on those plants go extinct. So you can have it sort of going both ways. So on the sort of bottom up scale, we have a good example here in Australia of mountain pygmy possums, which are these tiny, cute. They're so cute, it's almost disgusting when you look at them. You just want one. They're these beautiful little possums that live up in the high country in New South Wales and Victoria, and they really depend on a type of moth called the bogong moth. And that moth, it used to be quite abundant, but because of both climate change as well as habitat loss and changing use of water in agriculture, they've really dwindled. And the mountain pygmy possum really depends on the bogong moth to gain enough energy so that it can reproduce. So this critically endangered little possum that depends on this otherwise innocuous moth species, and they're beautiful moths, don't get me wrong, but it's not the sort of thing that people focus on the cute little mammal. They don't focus necessarily on the insects that feed them. So unless we get a handle on what's happening to the bogong moth and turn around those processes that drive them down, we will likely see the loss of the pygmy possum because they're already in a precarious state.
I don't know, what are some new inputs to the models that appear to be making them better? And how do you get feedback on the models? Let's say you model up, a particular moth or creature, and you predict it's going to, have these numbers in the future and go extinct at this point. How do you keep up with the model and make sure the model's right? what kind of feedback you're looking for.
You mean sort of like a validation then?
Yes.
Yeah.
Or that
well,
it's wrong and,
of course, when you're dealing with a model of this scale, individual species aren't actually tied to real species. They sort of represent the range of species that we see within the diversity of species on land today. So you take one sort of agent out of that model, we can't tie that to a specific species. So this is very much sort of a relative expectation of change. So we're looking at different climate change scenarios, the emissions pathways basically from the IPCC, and then we look at the relative change of expected extinction from those different scenarios. Now, if you look at a single system or a single species or various species that are connected either through hosts and parasites or pollination, we can look at that more on fine scale, but we can't actually upscale that to the entire planet. And the main reason is most of these models rely on the linkage of who eats whom. So it's what we call a trophic linkage. And despite having studied, hundreds of thousands of species for centuries, we still actually have a very poor understanding of the diet composition of species across the planet. The worst case scenarios are really in terms of herbivores and plants. Let's say grazing bison eats grass, but it actually has a very selective preference for particular species, and that probably changes depending on where it is. We know it eats grass, but what species of grass? We know that certain possums eat leaves and some fruits, but they might be taking fruit and leaves from hundreds of different tree species. So this lack of data doesn't really allow us to look at the specifics of any given species anywhere on the planet. We're talking about relative loss of the total diversity. So the way I like to think about it is, if you look out your window in 2100 and compare it to the number of species that you see today, on average, you're likely to see about 50%, up to 50% fewer species, more likely in the sort of 17 to 25% range. But that doesn't mean necessarily that the species you're not seeing have gone extinct. It just means in your particular area, they're not there anymore.
But what does it mean for something to be endangered, critically endangered, and extinct? Is it just there's not enough members of the population to breed with another to keep the genetic diversity to sustain the population, or are there other factors?
Yeah, okay. This comes back to the concept of what we call the minimum viable population size, and that's closely tied to genetic diversity and that whole concept of inbreeding that we talked about earlier. But it really turns out that if a population of any given species is below a few thousand, then it starts to get into that area of susceptibility to disturbances that wouldn't normally cause a problem. This is this small population paradigm I talked about earlier. So because it can't necessarily escape from a localized disturbance because its range is very small, because there are very few individuals and they occupy that particular area, or because of the lack of genetic diversity drives them into this extinction vortex, because they just don't have the fitness, individual level fitness, to be able to produce more individuals fast enough to counteract whatever's driving them down in the first place. So it's kind of a rule of thumb. We have this thing in conservation biology called the 5,500 rule, which has been around for donkey's years. And it's basically the idea that you need 50 individuals in a population to avoid inbreeding depression, and you need 500 individuals to avoid loss of evolutionary potential. So that's the idea that you can evolve to adapt to change. The work we've done genetically as well as just on sort of demographic concepts shows that those are really too small. And we should be doubling that rule to the 1,000 rule, which basically means you need 100 completely outbred individuals to avoid inbreeding depression, at least 1,000 individuals to maintain evolutionary potential. But when I say 100 completely outbred individuals, there's almost no wild population of any species out there that is entirely made up of outbred individuals. There's always some level of inbreeding going on. On average, as it turns out, that what we call the effective population size, so that's the number of completely outbred individuals if everything was completely different, compared to the number of census individuals, those are the ones you count in a population, the ratio is about 1 in 10. So really you need about 10 times as many individuals that you count on land to be able to avoid that inbreeding depression. So we're talking about, tens of thousands, if not tens of thousands of individuals in any population to have that kind of capability of dealing with stresses that come along.
So far as I know, the ability to reproduce averages back in, extremes, a really large koala, a really tiny one, one that has this exaggeration or that exaggeration. As species become less and less genetically diverse, do people tend to see more extremes in the species? Again, weird misshapen ones or huge ones or small ones or ones with problems?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And you mentioned koalas. That's another great example. We have a very highly inbred population of koalas in South Australia. In fact, they were reintroduced here from small populations in Victoria. And those small populations grew up into larger populations, but they don't have very much genetic diversity. And we see lots of incidents of plasia. So, weird deformation of genitalia. We see liver function problems. We see a higher susceptibility to disease, including things like chlamydia. So yes, they're kind of a little bit broken, if you will. And yes, you can get more variation in size. And one of the things, coming back to koalas, which is sort of one of my pet hypotheses at the moment, is that when you get inbreeding happening, you actually end up getting, in some cases, higher localized densities of individuals, which can cause overbrowsing and then tree death, which then causes these massive losses of the koalas in that area because of a lack of food. And the reason I think this is the case is because in a very healthy outbred population, you get very strong dominance of the largest individuals, so high territoriality. And that actually excludes a lot of the younger individuals, the smaller individuals from that area, thereby reducing the local density, and it prevents kind of overbrowsing. But when you get inbreeding depression, you don't get as many of these large dominant individuals in the population, so they kind of all cram in together and they eat themselves out of house and home. Now, we still have a long way to go to sort of show that, but this idea has brought about work that we're doing actually now on koalas and other species on what we call genetic rescue. So this is the idea of taking a healthy outbred, genetically diverse individual from a healthy population and bringing over enough of them into the inbred population so that you can actually spread that genome throughout the local inbred population and thereby genetically rescue it, inverted commas. It's been done in a few cases. The mountain pygmy possums is actually one example where it's actually worked to some degree, but we don't have a general rule of thumb about how to do that. So we're actually working with these inbred koalas in South Australia just to see if it can be done, and what kind of intensity of reintroduction and over what timeframes and spatial scales we need to do it. So this is a definitely one tool in the conservation biologist toolbox.
Okay, got it. So are there any species that you're modeling that are, very quickly headed for extinction versus others where it's a slower pace? And what factors govern that?
Yeah, well, it's, it really depends on how fast the species does its life cycle. So it tends to work out that, very slow life history species. So these are things that are sort of take a long time to breed. They don't mature very quickly, and then they live a long time, but they only have a few offspring every breeding cycle. And, we've actually been doing a lot of work on various species of shark. Probably think, oh, fish, they breed a lot. But actually, sharks are kind of like, if you think of it in terms of their life history, they're kind of more like a big mammal. They grow slowly. They don't start breeding until they are 5 or 6 years old. Many species only have 1 or 2 pups every year or every other year. And they live quite a long time, sometimes 25, 30, 40 years. And certain species like grey nurse sharks, for example, in Australia, which are also endangered, have this kind of very slow life history. And, any sort of intense fishing pressure or shark meshing can drive those sort of species into an extinction vortex very quickly. And we've done some modeling showing that, for example, these grey nurse sharks are very susceptible to even small amounts of harvest, whether that's direct or indirect. If you think of things like, pandas is a great example. Again, another very slow species, or elephants. Elephants are on a massive decline. Giraffes, rhinoceros, these big, slow species. Even a small amount of poaching, for example, on rhinoceros will drive those populations into such a small number that they get into this, extinction vortex very quickly. And we're actually seeing that and the loss of these large mammals throughout Africa today. I was in the Kruger National Park in South Africa back in 2019, and that Kruger is probably the most well-protected, most financed, and one of the larger parks in Africa. And they were losing on average about 2 white rhino a day from poaching. And you can actually, you can almost see the population dwindle before your eyes. And this is happening all across sub-Saharan Africa. We probably have fewer than 5 to 10% of the original the savanna elephant population across southern Africa that we did 200 years ago. Giraffes are in a similar situation. These large species are usually the ones that drop off the perch the first.
Makes sense. Okay. So are there any other factors you're looking at in your modeling that, you feel like they're important, but you can't get your arms around them yet as to the impact? Any mystery variables that you're working on?
Yeah, I guess the next step in this phase of modeling is to really tie it more to extinction of species per se rather than diversity loss. So we plan to do that by sort of incorporating more of a spatial structure into the species identity in these models. So right now we just basically, you take a certain area of the planet, as I said, you sort of look out your window, is that species going to be there in 50 years compared to today? But that, as I said, doesn't necessarily mean it's extinct, because it could be somewhere else. But we want to be able now to accumulate all of the areas where these species are and look at the total loss of the entire population of all the cells where it occupies across the globe, and then look at the sort of link this to the demography of particular populations and the chance of those going extinct across the entire species. So that's probably the next phase. The other thing that we're looking at doing now is actually transferring the same sort of modeling approach to the oceans, because we don't have a very strong understanding of extinction processes in the sea. We've actually probably had quite fewer extinctions over the last few hundred years. They do happen, and they do happen from things like overfishing and that sort of thing, but they probably go unnoticed a little bit more because we don't have the same degree of observation in the water as we do on land, because we don't live in the water, basically. But so ironically though, we also have better diet information for many marine species, so we can probably develop even better ecological models for looking at extinction cascades in the sea. So these are two main areas we want to work into over the next few years, and I think we'll come up with some pretty interesting results and probably some fairly scary results as well.
Well, very good. Where can people find out more about your work? Where can they go?
So a lot of my work I talk about on my blog that links to all the primary literature, and that's conservationbytes.com. That's conservation, BYTES, as in computer bytes. And I have quite a resource area there that people can look into. There's also quite a good repository of information on a lot of the big NGO sites like the World Wildlife Fund, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, the IUCN. People can check out the Red List of Threatened Species. You can just type in Red List, IUCNredlist.org, and get straight to there, and you look at specific species assessments. There's quite a wealth of information out there about the fate of species. So it just takes a little bit of Googling, basically.
Okay, well, very good. Well, Corey, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I appreciate it.
Thank you. My pleasure.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.